Well, good morning, everybody. So good to see you guys. If this is your first time here at Hill City, my name is John Wagler, and I'm part of this team. And just grateful you're spending a portion of your Sunday here. We are in the midst of the series called the Voice of the Heart, where we're taking a look at essentially emotional health and our core emotions, and how truly that is our ability to be emotionally healthy actually directly relates to our spiritual health, to our ability to appreciate the reality of this message of Jesus and what it means to the deep in the core of our being. And so we're spending 8 weeks on this, and as we've done every week, how many of you guys want to be emotionally healthy? Yeah, leave it up. Maybe wave it at everybody. Yeah, old school, raise the roof a little bit. There we go. Yeah, there we go. But that's what we want, right? We want to be emotionally healthy individuals for so many reasons, but in particular, obviously, it directly correlates with every relationship that we have, whether that's with how we view ourselves, how we view other people, and then ultimately, of course, how we view God. And so it becomes so critical. And so here's our feelings chart that we've kind of looked at each week from the book Voice of the Heart by Chip Dodd. And so we've done resentment, we've done apathy, we've done hurt, we've done loneliness, we've done sadness. Today, we're doing this sucker right there, anger. And so we're going to take a look at that here today, and some of you guys are really excited. Some of you guys who maybe run a little hot, you're like, finally, this is my day. And or you're like with someone, you're like, finally, this is your day. And so, but we're going to talk about anger today. But I was thinking about anger. I saw this clip from the Dallas Cowboys game, at the end of the Dallas Cowboys game. I just thought, this is appropriate. So let's take a look at maybe how we think about anger in this way. So maybe that's how we think about anger. All the Commander fans are like, yeah, we get it. And so, but yeah, so we think about anger in an interesting way, and I think we have like kind of one concept around anger typically. But my hope is today that it deepens our understanding of what that emotion is and what's driving it. But it also allows us to see how God wants to speak into it and why it's so important and why it's such a pivotal emotion that we all have. And so here's the thing about anger. It's always pointing to something else. So if you think about this, you guys know this, right? It's the light you ignore in your car. I want you to think about this in terms of anger. Anger is telling you something else is going on. The anger you feel, the anger that might come out of you, or maybe that you're stuffing away, something else is going on inside of you. It's an indicator that you got to get some things in check. It's critical. So many things. Anger is such an interesting emotion because it's impacted by so many things in our lives. We just sang about fear and guilt and shame, like saying goodbye to those things, but those things also impact our anger. And you can see so many different things around this. And so this emotion of anger, this core emotion of anger is actually really pivotal in terms of how we begin to understand. It should immediately say, hey, there's something else going on inside of us when anger starts to rise up. And so when you look at anger, again, I'm going to hear, we see this, that there's the impairment to anger is depression and pride. All right, you might think like those two things don't go together, and we're going to talk about why they're different and how they kind of play into this. But the impairment of anger, unprocessed anger, is depression and pride. The gift of anger, yes, there is a gift, is passion. And so in the book, Chip writes it this way. He says, in truth, anger is possibly the most important feeling we experience as emotional and spiritual beings because it is the first step to authentic living. It shows our hunger and yearning for life. And so even this element of anger, on the front end, we always think of it negatively, but there is a positive element to it, that there's a driving passion that could be there. That gift is a wonderful, wonderful thing that if we process our anger correctly, man, it brings life to who we are. But unprocessed anger, which we've all probably have received or have actually done to someone else, is actually incredibly detrimental. And so when we think about unprocessed anger, I want to go through a few things here. Unprocessed anger leads to a lack of discernment. How many guys have raged or flown off the handle a little bit, right? You didn't sit there at that moment in time you got done and thought to yourself, man, that was super wise. Like the other person on the other end wasn't sitting there being like, thank you so much for imparting your wisdom to me, like in that moment. And so we understand that right off the cusp of this, it's like, man, unprocessed anger, we lack discernment. I love Proverbs 14:29. It says that slowness to anger makes for deep understanding. A quick-tempered person, I love this phrase, stockpiles stupidity. And you know, are there some people that run a little hotter than others? Yeah, like that's a thing, like that can happen, okay? But man, you got to pause. All of us have to pause and understand that this quick-tempered element that's there really is causing us to be foolish. It's causing us to ruin relationships. It's causing us to lack wisdom. It's causing us. I prefer this translation of the verse because it's just easy to remember that I'm stockpiling stupidity. And so it's important to understand that. And so a lot of times you might have grown up with a parent that had unprocessed anger, and you realize the way that they treated, the way that they yelled, the way that they did something, whatever that something was, the way that they disciplined, whatever, there was unprocessed anger that was going on, and they were actually, there was like stockpiling stupidity on how they parented. And then that actually brought up some things in you and nurtured some things in you that maybe you're actually having to suffer from right now or process right now. Like, can that happen? Yeah, that can happen. Maybe it's something that developed in you later on in life, and it wasn't because of your parents. It was because of something that you went through, and you had unprocessed anger. And in the midst of this, you became quick-tempered, and you started snapping on people, and you started realizing, man, I'm stockpiling stupidity in everything that I'm doing. And I see it in my decisions, and I see it in all of my relationships. And this unprocessed anger results in foolishness and hurts everything around us. You know, one of the other quotes in there, he says, when he talks about like rage and this kind of quick-tempered element, Chip says it this way, he says, rage denies our humanity with a willful fury against vulnerability. That this rage that comes out of us, this rage that we participate in, this rage that comes out in unprocessed anger that leads to essentially stupidity is really what he's saying. It's like, it's caused because we aren't vulnerable people. And the lack of vulnerability means that we're hiding something. And listen, God will never transform anything that we keep hidden. So it's not gonna, if you keep something hidden, it's like you're keeping it hidden. God just doesn't go in on the back end and be like, hey, let me take care of this really easily so you don't have to deal with it. It's no, we have to be honest and we have to be vulnerable about the reality of what's going on inside of us. And this lack of vulnerability is really problematic. That actually inhibits us from truly engaging the world around us and people around us. It stops us from transforming, to actually receiving what the Spirit of God has for us and be able to transform. A lot of times this can come out, you know, and you see it in little kids, like when they're little, like, you know, toddlers, and they throw temper tantrums. You ever seen this? You know, and maybe you've experienced this. And, you know, you look at them, you can't go to like a 2-year-old and be like, I need you to be a little vulnerable, buddy. Like what's really good, you could try, but they can't like fully like get there and communicate it. And that lack of vulnerability is one of the things that causes, like they have so much emotion and everything. But here's what's interesting. If you're like a teenager in this room right now, you have the ability to articulate your emotions. And the lack of vulnerability will move you into kind of this state of temper tantrums. And here's what's crazy. Like in adults, we see this. Like I've been with adults who still eye roll. And you might be thinking like, well, that's not. It's like, no, I mean, that's an element. That's an element of like, you're not processing emotion in the right way. And so we can see this even in adults, like temper tantrums can just look differently as adult. You're not going to lay on the ground and, you know, stomp your feet and like all this other stuff in Target. But like you have like another way that maybe you rage, another way that you're interacting and throwing a temper tantrum. What is that? That there's something inside of you need to be more vulnerable about so that you can start to process what that rage is. And so rage is interesting because when you think about even scientifically, rage happens in the same place as our like fight or flight or freeze, you know, moment of our brains. And what they've done is they've studied brain patterns. And when we're in a state of rage, All right, so unprocessed rage. We have the same brain patterns as a gorilla. So next time you start raging like that, you are being received like an animal. Because that's what you're doing. You're just like a gorilla. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if they even talk that way, but like they're just. But that's what it is. Like that's how you are being received by people in the rage, and that's what your brain is actually doing. Rage is actually interesting because it's just basically screaming, "I'm not getting what I want." That's what rage is doing, and rage is interesting too because what rage will do is it makes you operate in extremes and in like more of like everything's black and white. And so you begin to see like this is what starts to happen inside of us. Rage happens when we won't admit to what emotion we're actually feeling. So the moments when you really raged, it wasn't that you were feeling, there was something else going on inside of you that is like making you rage. But you won't know what that is until you're actually going to have the time to take the time to be vulnerable and understand your emotions. Rage happens because we see we can't control something, and so then we lose our self-control. And so it's interesting, self-control is one of the fruit of the Spirit that I think always gets lost. We can name a lot of the other ones, but so often, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, goodness. And we always forget self-control. And I forgot faithfulness, but we forget like self-control. It's like self-control is actually one of the fruit of the Spirit. And so when you're losing your self-control, guess what? You're not acting like who? Jesus. And if you're not acting like Jesus, I know y'all hate it when I do this. If you are acting like Jesus, there's only another option. You're not acting like nothing. We're acting like what promotes evil. That's fun, right? To kind of process it in that way. But that is what happens when we begin to lose our control. Here's what happens when you're in rage. In rage, you feel justified creating a traumatic experience for somebody else. With rage, what it shows you is you're actually really disconnected from what's going on inside of you. That's rage. So unprocessed anger leads to a lack of discernment and stockpiles stupidity. The second thing, unprocessed anger separates us from feeling alive. This is where kind of the impairment of depression comes in. And so I just want to talk about this for a minute. I personally have not had clinical depression. Talked to a ton of counselors, researched a ton. I know a lot of people and sat with a lot of people around it. And even Matt, our care pastor, we talk a lot about depression and stuff too, because he's fought through a lot of it and battles it and everything. And so he's helped open my eyes around some of the elements of it. And so I asked for grace around this, and only saying this because this is not something I've personally dealt with on that kind of level, but there is, when you start thinking about depression, depression is not a core emotion. Depression actually blocks us from engaging the core emotion that we should be engaging. And so it paralyzes us. It makes us feel like we're in quicksand, or it makes us feel like we're stuck, or we're in some kind of loop. And we begin to see that within this, the way that actually Chip talks about in the book is he says that depression is like you're depressing things away from you that are actually healthy. And you keep pressing all the things that actually make you feel alive and feel connected, like people and community and eating well and exercising and praying and meditating. It's like you press all those things away that eventually forms into depression. But there's something else that's going on inside of us. There's something else that we have to engage. There's something else that's critical for us to begin to understand. And Matt actually was telling me about an analogy he often uses that in this state, it's like you watch kids run down a hill, and you go down really fast, right? But sometimes if the hill's too steep, your legs just can't keep up. And so he uses that analogy of you're good at the top and you're still going in at the beginning. All of a sudden it just feels like it spins out of control. And it's but the healthier that we get, the longer we can run. And the faster we can run. And so we begin to see that, well, what is that? It's getting in touch with actually the core emotions that are actually causing it and discovering something different. And in particular, a lot of times we're angry about something else, and we're not actually coming to grips with something that we're actually really angry about. Like maybe we're actually really angry about like loneliness. And so we're not processing things the right way. And then all of a sudden it can lead us to a depressive state. I was reading in 1 Kings this week around Elijah. And we see this in Scripture, an element of a depressed state in one of the prophets of God. He says this. So he comes to a broom bush and sat down on a tree, and here's Elijah speaking. He's like, I've had enough. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And he got into this state. What's interesting is what we see in Elijah is what he was really angry at was his loneliness in the midst of the mission that he was on. What he was really struggling with was the fact that people were not listening to God. And so there was an element where as he's engaged in all this, he was deeply hurt by the people that should have been listening to him were not. And then all of a sudden his world got flipped upside down. And it was kind of causing him to spin. And he lands in this place of unprocessed emotion, even though he's trying to do the work of God. This unprocessed emotion that was there led him into a depressed state, and he didn't feel alive. Actually, he didn't want to be alive. And so we begin to see, even in our current culture, you look at the world around us, we're the most medicated we've ever been. And it's not even close. And we're the loneliest we've ever been. And in the midst of all of this stuff, it's not working. Well, why is that? And because we're not in touch with what's really going on inside of us, with our emotion, what's really deep inside of us, and coming into grips with those realities that will kind of put us into the place that we need to be. And the other part of this about not feeling alive is pride. How many guys have ever struggled with pride? Yeah. So, some of you that didn't raise your hand, you do. Your lack of humility there. But anyway, we all struggle with pride in some capacity. And here's what pride does, which is like really interesting. Pride will simply just say this, hey, I can do this on my own. Or pride will say it's not my fault. Pride will say, blame everybody else. Pride will really like separate us from the truth of what matters. It will separate us from for sure separate us from God, but it separates us from people. It separates from the things that actually will make us healthy. Pride is so incredibly destructive. I love this passage in Matthew 5 because Jesus is talking to these people who he's describing what it means to follow him. And what's interesting is he digs into this heart part of this, the core of your being. And then it's pride that can drive us away from an acknowledgement of how bad something might be. And so he says this, you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder, right? Which that sounds normal. He says, if you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, Jesus says this, if you are even what? With someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. Seems like Jesus is saying we need to process our anger. Well, why is that? Because your pride will tell you that, I would never. Well, it's not my fault. Your pride will do something that separates. But what Jesus is saying is that there's something inside of us that when our pride builds up and it's like, oh, my anger will never do this. I would never murder someone. But guess what you would do, and you have done, and we all have done, is we've killed the image of God in other people. Where did that start? In our hearts. See, when we don't see people the way God sees people, it's prideful. When we don't see people the way God sees people, there's something in our hearts that isn't right. We are killing the image of God in someone else. We murder it. It stems from something that's happening at the core of our being. And when pride starts seeping in, we can be religiously prideful. And you might be thinking like, yeah, that's why I'm so passionate about other people's sin, right? And we get so passionate about other people's sin because we lack the humility to come to grips with our own, right? Like that's what actually happens. But the pride that builds up inside of us, we become so judgmental and condescending of the world around us. We even see, even culturally, the way pride kind of rises up and through anger, even politically, right? Anger is like the currency that happens. And pride is the currency that happens within our political system. It's fascinating to me, and we'll talk more about this in the fall. Dun, dun, dun. Around politics, but someone's platform doesn't matter if they're stockpiling stupidity through their pride and anger. So I don't know why we as Christians would ever support anyone that is so prideful and so angry in any kind of way. Any man or woman. I don't know why we would ever vote for them, because they're just stockpiling stupidity. And their platform doesn't actually matter, because they're going to do whatever they want to do. And so we begin to see, even the way that we engage this idea of anger and pride, and even culturally, it deeply matters as those who say they follow Jesus. Here's the third thing with unprocessed anger leaves us without hope. That's why I love that song, Fear is Not My Future. We'll talk about fear next week, but even this fear is not my future. It's, we think about Elijah. He was in a state of fear. He lost hope. And when people end up losing hope, they double down on misery, they double down on pride, they double down on all the things that actually lead them into a further unhealthy state. But when hope starts to rise up inside of us, something begins to change. I love this guy named David in the Bible. Some of you guys might know his story, and maybe heard the story about David and Goliath. But part of his story, he wrote several of the Psalms that we have in our Bible. And his ability, now he was like a dumpster fire in a lot of ways, but his ability to process emotion was incredible. You read it in the Psalms, his ability to engage what was going on inside of him was so good. And in Psalm 23, I love this, one of the most famous Psalms, and we'll sing about this at the end, but I love this part of the Psalm because he's had so much come at him, and he's had moments of anger that he's expressed, and people are coming after him, all this stuff. But he says this, and you can tell he's processing his anger. He's processing the things that he's going through. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, meaning you're providing in the presence of my enemies, you're providing for me. You anoint my head with oil, meaning the presence of God is on me, and my cup overflows. I might feel empty, but here's when I can process things correctly, I can see I overflow through the way that God provides. He says, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So his perspective, he went from, he could have been an unprocessed anger that was happening inside him because of what he was seeing, but as he's processing it, there's this passion that's starting to develop inside of him, this passion to see the world the way God sees the world, to see the situations the way God sees it. And so he could say things like, man, I'm going to experience your goodness and mercy all the days of my life. You're well, hold on, David. David, they're coming to kill you. He's you know what, though? I can see that someday I would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It doesn't mean he's ignoring anything. He's just seeing it the way God wants them to see it and processing it and really working through all of it. And the song we sing is "Shall Not Want," but I'm not lacking because I know that God is with me in this and allows me to process things the right way. So then what does this look like? So then if the unprocessed is depression and pride, then the processed anger is passion. It's passion. And so I want to talk about what godly anger is. And so there's an element to how we get to this gifting, all right? So you might be saying, God gets angry. And yeah, it actually says that he does get angry. In Exodus chapter 34, it says this, that the Lord is compassionate and a gracious God, slow to what? Abounding in love and faithfulness. And it's funny, sometimes people will be like, I can't believe God gets mad. I'm like, why would you not want God to get mad? Do you want him to passively sit by and just let stuff happen? Would you just not want him not to be involved and just separate and be like, all right, humans. That doesn't work. We know that. So for God to get angry at certain things actually is incredibly important. We saw that God got angry at sin And so he sees like, I'm going to take care of this. So it's incredibly important that God gets angry. But it says that he's slow to anger. The word there means long-nosed or double-nosed. This idea of being slow to anger. You know how you get those, and the reason why I talk about the nose piece, you know how like you go when you're mad? And then so it's this idea of like, oh, if it's like a really long nose and double nose, there's like, it takes just a long time. And so this reality of what it means to be slow to anger, that there's this piece of this, that godly anger has a passion for patience. And they seem like those things are opposite, right? But it's like, no, a godly anger has a passion for patience. And you begin to see, if you've been around people who do this really well, they have like a really long runway until maybe you experience their anger. But then when you do, you're like, oh, my bad. You know what I mean? Because you're like, they did such a great job of like being patient, being kind, being gracious, and trying to work through. But then when you experience maybe just a little heaviness in their words, or they come at it, and then you see them kind of like have a little more energy, you're like, oh yeah, that is my bad. I see it. And you appreciate it though, because you see that there's something that's good behind it. That it wasn't just reactionary, it wasn't just out of fury and rage, that there was something that was actually meaningful behind all of it. The patience means for us that anger rarely comes. Like that kind of, you don't feel it like welling up inside of you. You see like you have a passion for things, but this idea like anger doesn't come like in the way that you think it does very often. I'm so patient with people. You think about God's patience. Have any of y'all ever like thought why God hasn't wiped us out again? You look at the world around you and you're like, if I were God, I'd be like, you know what? We're getting a do-over again. But here's why. He's so patient and loving and kind. And here's why. He sees the beauty and the possibility of what's inside of us. So he's slow to anger. Does there come a point sometimes where he engages? Yeah. Like there's a story in the Old Testament that talks about the Canaanites, and he responds to the Canaanites, and the Canaanites suffer a lot because of what they had, how they were living and everything, and you think like, how could God like do that to people? And it's like he actually waited 400 years before he acted. He was like generation after generation after generation. He's like, I'm giving you guys everything. I'm giving you guys everything, but I can't stand that you're hurting people anymore. And I've got to step in. And so we see that, man, this patience that builds. It's like God sees the possibilities. He sees the beauty. And he has the patience to begin to engage it. You might be thinking like, yeah, but Jesus flipped tables, Wags. It's like there's one story, maybe two, depending on who you read. And that story is so nuanced. But really, what was Jesus really mad about? Jesus was mad because of religious hypocrisy, oppression of the poor and marginalized, and acting like fools that blocked people from experiencing him. And so, yeah, he flipped a table. But guess what else he did soon after that? He went up on a cross and died for those same people. So there's something to the way that he engages. Here's something I want you to think about with anger. Our anger should never lead to an inaccurate portrayal of who Jesus is. Should never lead to an inaccurate portrayal of who Jesus is. His love, his grace, his kindness, his goodness, all those things. Second thing that godly anger does, has a passion for what is just. It has a passion for what is just. Matthew 5, this is Jesus talking. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be what? Yeah. So to not have this hunger and thirst for things that are just means that you'll live a life that isn't quite full. You'll let things slide. You'll have a heart for comfort rather than a heart for justice. And then you'll never fully experience life. You'll never fully be engaged the way God wants us to be. In Proverbs, it also says this. It says in 21:3, it says, to do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. So he's like, you can come to church and bring all you want. You can go to this temple and bring your sacrifices to me, but actually what I really care about is you doing the right thing, the things that are just. And having a heart for justice. And godly anger has a heart that's for justice. You see this in people like Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King Jr., like we saw, even like someone like Bono, right now, or William Wilberforce, whatever. Like you got all these people that have this huge heart for justice. Well, that connects to the reality of who Jesus is, who God desires us to be. If we don't have a heart for justice, then we don't have the same kind of heart that God desires. What ends up happening a lot of times is we might have, I remember when went down to the protests here in Richmond, there's a difference between people who were there that had a passion for justice versus people that were just raging. When you rage, it's just everything is just like, oh, it's just black and white and work on extremes. And it's like, no, when people had passion for justice, there was nuance, there was engagement, there was this desire to bring people together. You see, when we just operate out of rage within the context of injustice, it means we haven't fully processed the hurt that we feel, and so we respond accordingly. But when we really have a heart for justice, we want to see things happen, and we want to talk about what it looks like. We want to engage with one another in such a deep and profound way. Even what we just saw, with the latest police shootings down in Memphis. And you see, what does a heart for justice look like? It isn't just consequence, though that's part. But there is like an element that we start seeing like, man, there's a lot of stuff broken, y'all. Like broken. And diversity training won't fix it. That's becoming more and more proven that like diversity training doesn't actually move the needle as much as we think that it does. It really is what's the problem? There's a heart thing going on that is shaped within the context of the culture. And that's what Jesus was talking about. You got to get down to the heart of people. Do laws matter? Yes. Policies matter? Yes. Like consequences for things matter? Yes, it matters. But I'm talking about if we want to see like change, you have to dig into the heart of people. And if you are a follower of Jesus, if you're not a follower of Jesus in this room, do whatever you want. If you're a follower of Jesus, you should hunger and thirst for righteousness in the heart of people. It should drive everything that we are. And so when we see injustice in this world, we should step forward, we should say something, we should be involved, we should figure out how do we become part of a solution rather than continuing to lay back and like, it's really complicated. It's like, no, that's not a heart for justice. That's a heart for comfort. That's actually incredibly prideful. See, but we have a heart for justice to want to engage and to learn and to say, like, what in my heart actually continues injustice? Or what in my heart needs to be shifted and changed? Or how can I learn to be a part of something that ends up being healthy and engages the way God wants us to? And here's the last thing. Godly anger has a passion for the fullness of life. We become vulnerable. We crave intimacy. We have courage. We have curiosity. There's a deep hunger inside of us for all of these things. There's the passion that builds in us it sounds different. I wrote a few things down. I said, you might start saying things like this. I'm angry at sadness because I feel for what I lost, but I'm passionate to experiencing healing and hope again. I'm angry at the fear I have of another relationship failing, but I will be passionate about doing the right things to make sure it won't happen again. I'm angry at the choices I've made from the hurt, but I'm passionate about wise counsel and learning what I might be missing. I'm angry at the cause of my depression, but I'm passionate about every tool accessible to me to make me whole. I'm angry at the shame I feel from my past, but I'm passionate about experiencing the grace of God. I'm angry at the injustices I see, but I'm passionate about challenging with grace and bringing people together. See, when we process anger, this is like a fullness of life. We get to experience all that God has, and here's what starts to change. Our hope does. Our relationships radically start changing. Our view of the world around us starts changing. We start being able to see the beauty that God sees. rather than just always raging against it. Our hearts begin to shift and change. So I want us to all just pause here for a minute. We're going to sing one more song together as the band comes up. You can bow your heads. I just want you to maybe come to grips with some of the things that you're realizing are unprocessed anger. Maybe you're lacking patience, or maybe you've given in to depression being a core emotion for you. Maybe you've neglected to see where pride has been rising up inside of you. Maybe you started letting negativity and misery write a narrative. God, this morning just before we sing this last song of experiencing your goodness and mercy and proclaiming that we shall not want, God, I pray that we would pause and reflect on what you're speaking to our hearts right now. Do I have a passion for what you want me to be? Do I have a passion for the life you desire for me, or am I living in a whole other way? Will you stand and sing this last song?